Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's so nice to see everyone. I am Jamie Seward. I'm Associate Director of Affinity Engagement Programs with the Office of Alumni Relations. And before we proceed, I'd like to acknowledge our sponsors, the Sheridan Libraries and the University Museums, the Friends of Johns Hopkins University Libraries, and the Arts, Entertainment, Media, and Entrepreneurship Affinity. Now, before I turn the program over to Jim Williams, President of the Friends of the Libraries, I encourage you to ask questions by typing them in the Zoom Q&A at the bottom of your screen. The chat is also live, but it would be easier for us if you could put your questions in the Zoom Q&A, please. We'll have time to answer your questions at the end of the program. Now, I have the pleasure of turning the program over to Jim Williams. Jim, would you like to share your camera with us?
Heidi, I tried to open it, but it says unable to start video. You can't start your video because the host has stopped it.
You can share your video now. There you go. Perfect.
Ah, here we are.
There you are.
Thanks, Jamie. And thank you so much for all of you joining us today for our Lunch with the Libraries talk about the fascinating historic cookbooks contained in the Sheridan Library's Department of Special Collections. As mentioned, I'm Jim Williams, President of the Friends of the Johns Hopkins University Libraries. Our Friends group is extremely proud of how this speaker series is highlighting the many wonderful reasons that we support the libraries. As always, we are grateful to our co-sponsor, the JHU Alumni Affinity Group, and their wonderful staff for making this series possible. We also want to thank our current members of the Friends for all of their support of the Sheridan Libraries and Hopkins students during this challenging time. If you haven't yet become a friend of the libraries, you can do so by making a gift at libraries.jhu.edu/give. Today's talk seems most timely as we are beginning to think about Thanksgiving meals. So it is a special pleasure to introduce Heidi Herr, who is phenomenal at making our collections come alive. From playing a board game made by suffragettes to recreating recipes from antiquarian cookbooks, she makes primary source research exciting and experiential. Heidi is the outreach librarian for Hopkins Special Collections, as well as the librarian for the English and Philosophy departments. She also oversees our Freshman Fellows program, which provides mentorship and funding for 4 students as they conduct original research with our rare books and archival collections. Heidi holds MA degrees in English and Library Science from the University of Maryland. Before turning the program over to Heidi, I would like to announce that there is going to be a follow-up to today's lecture on Tuesday, December 29th, featuring some local chefs and their favorite holiday recipes. Heidi will elaborate on this upcoming seminar during her presentation. In the meantime, thank you all for being with us today and for all that you do for our students. Heidi, what's cooking?
Thank you so much for that great introduction, that lovely introduction. And we do indeed have lots cooking today. I am so excited to have this opportunity to share with you a selection of our historic cookbooks. This is an area that we have actively been acquiring in special collections for the past few years. And one of the best things about these cookbooks is seeing undergraduate reactions to them. These cookbooks have proved to be amazing platforms to introducing students to the joys and challenges of conducting research with primary sources. And I'm really happy to announce that one of our freshmen, who is part of the Freshman Fellows programs, is researching our historic cookbook collection. And every week I get these fabulous emails from him in which he is just amazed at the things that he's discovered, the types of recipes, the personalities that he sees, the histories that he's learned. So hopefully you will feel the same level of excitement about the cookbooks I'm going to share with you today. The cookbooks I've selected are mostly cookbooks that were written by women, and they span the centuries and indeed the continents too. And I hope you enjoy this culinary journey. So let's get started with cooking. All right, so I'm going to stop my video and I'm going to share my screen. And hopefully everything works. Okay. So what we are looking at is an illustration from one of my favorite items in our collection, a Jell-O pamphlet. And this was something that a student suggested for purchase. And I personally love this pamphlet because it makes me think of my grandmother and my great-grandmother. They were complete and total Jell-O queens. If they could encase anything at all in Jell-O. And I remember, if you see up top here, this like salad encased in a layer of Jell-O, my great grandmother would make dishes like this all the time. Granted, I refused to eat these things, but I nonetheless was charmed by them, by how beautiful and weird they were. And I really do believe that my lifelong love for all things kitchen and camp began with my grandmother cooking things in Jell-O. And that's one of the things about cookbooks, right? And recipes and food. We have this connection to them that make us think about things from the past. You know, birthday party, like the best birthday cake ever, right? And I think that's one of the reasons why today we find cookbooks so compelling. And don't worry, while we're starting with Jell-O, we're going to be proceeding away from it for a little bit. But as we all know, there's always room for J-E-L-L-O. So we'll be coming back to Jell-O at the end of the presentation. So this won't be the last you'll see of gelatin encased lettuce and sundaes and all that jazz. But as I mentioned, we use these cookbooks quite a bit for teaching students how to analyze objects, how to think critically about books from the past. And as we go on this culinary journey together, these are some of the concepts and themes we're going to be talking about. We're going to be looking at issues such as who wrote the cookbook, who was the intended audience, and why was this particular cookbook written? We'll also be addressing issues of labor. For instance, was the reader of the text expected to do the cooking? As well as at times looking at the ingredients and the tools needed to figure out if these recipes were indeed something that were meant to be consumed daily, or if these recipes were more aspirational in tone, if they were meant to be something that you'd like to know about and to be part of, but you really couldn't afford to produce. And then too, we're going to be looking at cookbook statements to try to figure out exactly why these cookbooks were written. And believe it or not, these cookbooks at times were often quite political in tone, and they reveal quite a lot about gender norms, culture wars, and political issues of the times. So these books are more than just collections of recipes. They really are vibrant documents of the times in which they were written. So when we talk about historic cookbooks and we think about cookbooks in our collection, the oldest cookbook we have dates from 1541, and it's written in Latin. So that alone kind of tells us that this cookbook, because it was written in a language that most people couldn't read or understand, that this was meant to be a work of scholarship, not necessarily something that was meant to be used in the kitchen. So this is called On the Subject of Cooking. And it is allegedly a cookbook that documents a series of manuscripts, Roman manuscripts from around the 3rd century. So it's a kind of basically treatise on various vegetables and their properties and the best ways to prepare them. And if you look here, you'll see a familiar word, asparagus. So this section here kind of talks about ways to prepare asparagus. And if you look, you see this lovely A, this lovely woodblock initial. So you can tell that this was meant to mimic, in a sense, manuscript books of the era, that this book was meant to look professional and academic in tone. Now, while this book dates to about 1541, the very first cookbook that was to the 1470s. And it's similar to the one in our collection in that it is written in Latin and it was meant to be an academic work. Now, what's kind of interesting is that cookbooks as a genre, as a printed genre, didn't really take off until closer to the 18th century. And there's a lot of debate as to why this was the case. Some people believe that it was thought that the cookbook written as a document really wasn't worthy of being printed, especially in the 15th and 16th centuries, as people were trying to figure out what was worthy of being printed. It was normally things like religious works, philosophies, classical texts. The cookbook was considered to be somewhat lowly, and indeed the cook, outside of the verified realm of the aristocracy, was viewed as a lowly profession. So there might have been a level of snobbery and a sense that, you know, these types of recipes, they weren't worthy of being collected and printed in such a manner, in this manner. They're not meant to be cherished and kept and disseminated in the way we would say. But be that as it may, while you don't really have a lot of printed cookbooks from the 15th or 16th centuries, these do exist in manuscript form, and they are really interesting. So here we have the earliest printed cookbook in our collection that was compiled by a woman. So we're looking at Jane Spencer, her choice recate book. And recate or recate is a very obscure word for recipe. So this cookbook is really exciting because it's a collection of her choice or her favorite recipes. And if you look at the cookbook itself, here's its binding. And here's the first page. It has all the signs, all the markers. So this is something that was actually used in the kitchen. It has water stains. It has various, it's been singed along the sides. It probably got too close to the flame in the kitchen. And all these signs, while they may be a conservator's nightmare, they are nonetheless fascinating for those of us who study cookbooks, because we love nothing more than to see signs of use, signs of life in these texts. All these stains are almost like marginalia to us. They're wonderful. So let's just see, what did Jane Spencer, our cookbook compiler of 1699, just what were her favorite recipes? What were her choice recipes? How did she start her book? Well, here we go. The first two recipes are recipes for plague waters. Yes, if you had the misfortune of getting the plague, the very first two recipes allegedly will cure you. So she has various waters that will knock the cure right out of you, knock the plague right out of you, right? And what's so fascinating about these recipes that she includes have names. So this plague water recipe was from a man named Walter Raleigh. And what's so cool about this is that we could go through this cookbook and note all of the names and see if we can create a community or a network of recipe sharers. By having these names, we could then see if these individuals exist anywhere at all in the historic record, and see if we can figure out exactly who was Jane Spencer and what type of community was she a part of. Was she a lady of the house? Was she a servant? We know that she was educated, but beyond that, we don't really know much about her. But by revealing her community of recipe sharers, we may find a treasure trove of information that will bring her to life. Now, you may be surprised that these manuscript books, that these cookbooks contain recipes for, you know, various kind of cures for therapeutics, for, you know, prescription drugs, if you like, but this was really common. You just think about food you're going to consume. But in the past, the word recipe meant all sorts of things. It meant, you know, poisons for vermin. It meant kind of cures, you know, for the plague. And also, to us who see here, means recipes to make the most excellent oat cakes. So on this very first page, we have two recipes for plague water, and we have something that we consume, something that's meant to be pleasurable. So right off the bat, we realize that there's no real organizational structure to this cookbook. We're often used to cookbooks being divided into like recipes for like meats, for savories, for desserts. But here, perhaps, she was writing down the three most important things that she wanted to be able to find. And again, this is all conjecture because we don't know, but it's fun to kind of think about why these first three were selected. But now let's look a little bit more closely at this recipe. excellent oatcakes. And I must say that whenever I see the term excellent, I immediately think of Bill and Ted and their excellent adventure. So to me, this oatcake is the most excellent oatcake ever. And I have this whole entire weird fantasy of Bill and Ted going back in time and becoming chefs and having the most excellent culinary adventure ever. Anyway, back to Jane Spencer and her excellent oatcakes. I wanted to look at this recipe for a minute because this recipe shows the standard for how recipes were shared in both manuscript and print form up until around the 19th century. Today, when we look at recipes on an app or in a cookbook, there's certain things we expect to see, such as an ingredients list. We expect to see information about any sort of equipment we need to successfully make the recipe. We also expect to see information about prep time and cooking time, as well as serving size, right? None of this information is made available to cooks in the 17th, 18th, and for most of the 19th century. Basically, you get the title of the recipe and then you jump right into how to make it. So to make excellent oatcakes, is take half a peck of oatmeal and you break it in a stone mortar, very fine, and then sift it well. And then it goes on a little bit. It talks about the eggs that you need to add, how to strain it, how to prepare it. But there's certain problems if you wanted to recreate this today, right? And one of the problems has to do with measurements. It just says, for instance, that you add 4 spoonfuls of fine sugar. But what constitutes a spoonful? Today, we're so used to things, measuring cups. We have tablespoons, we have teaspoons. But in the 17th and 18th centuries, there was no real standardized spoon size. So that adds a complication to how to recreate these recipes. The other thing too is that as we go more into this recipe, toward the end, we see that she talks about the batter and that you're almost done making it because it's thicker than pancake batter. But if you've never made pancakes before, how do you know how thick pancake batter is supposed to be? So these sorts of indicators show that these recipes were very personal, that they were personalized, and that the person who was making them and the person who was sharing these recipes with others expected that their friends and colleagues and those who'd make them had a base understanding of cooking, that they knew what pancake batter was supposed to look like, that they would have an idea of what 4 standard spoonfuls would look like in that era. So there's a level and an understanding of expertise in recreating these dishes. So this is the second page of the Jane Spencer cookbook. And again, we see that much like the preceding page, you have a mix of these therapeutics. You have recipes to cure burns and to cure, colds. But on the same page, of course, you have things to make lemon cream, how to make an ordinary cheesecake. And one of the things to keep in mind is that while it was a standard to include all these different types of recipes in these manuscript cookbooks, in the 18th century, when cookbooks became a genre in their own right, this sort of mixing of medicinal and nourishing recipes was really controversial. It was quite contentious. And you actually see cookbook authors in their texts arguing about the merits or lack of merits of mixing these types of recipes in one book. But when we look at this particular page, you may notice something different, something weird happening. So we know that this cookbook belonged to Jane Spencer in 1699. But if you look at this, you'll notice that there are all these different hands. It's not the same hand writing these recipes. These handwritings look very, very different. And even the type of ink looks different too. You have lighter ink, you have more bold ink. So what ends up happening is this cookbook wasn't owned by just one individual, but by at least 3 different women. So we know this started with Jane Spencer in 1699, but it was then also owned by a woman named Mary Wise. This was her birth. And she gave it to a woman named Alice Dormer in 1728. So a really incredible research project would be to see if we could find what the relationship was between these 3 women. and then to look at and see if we could decipher the various handwriting and figure out which recipes were contributed by like which woman, and see if we can kind of figure anything out from that. So we might be able to recreate a really potent and exciting microhistory of 3 women cooks whose recipes spanned the late 17th century into the mid 18th. And that would just be really wild and really exciting. So I'm now moving away from the manuscript book to looking at a printed cookbook. And the reason being that Eliza Smith, the author of The Complete Housewife, her very first cookbook came out in print in 1727. So a year before Alice Dormer received that manuscript book and began to write out her own recipes. So Eliza Smith is a cook in the tradition of the Jane Spencer, Mary Wises, and Alice Dormers of the world. And her cookbooks contain a mix of recipes for savories as well as for medicines. And if you look at the illustration, this is the frontispiece to her cookbook, and it shows this ideal kind of kitchen. This is something that you would aspire to have. You would have lovely cooks dressed in their finery. You'd have beautiful china. You would have all sorts of meats and root vegetables on hand. You would have your very own beehives that you could watch from the window. You would have a wonderful servant ready to share the great cuisine that your chefs made. So this gives you a sense of, this is the type of lifestyle you could have perhaps as a lady's companion if you followed Eliza Smith's recipes. And this is just kind of a close-up of the title page. And you can see that this edition that we have is from 1757. And it mentions that it has a collection of over 300 family receipts or recipes of medicines. So in addition to having all these great recipes for cakes and jellies and wines, you also too had tons of things, including recipes that would allegedly cure you of a mad dog bite, along with directions for marketing. So this book was meant to be a one-stop shop for all of your cooking and shopping and medicinal needs. And it's also your one-stop shop for vomits. So Eliza Smith was basically the diva of vomits, of basically ways to purge yourself from illness. So on one page alone, you have an excellent vomit, a fine purge, and a purging diet drink for the spring. All sorts of great ways for you to get out any sort of sickness at all. And this type page in particular is really popular with our students because they just find this to be so incredibly bizarre that you would have excellent and fine vomits. But, you know, it was a thing of the 18th century, and Eliza Smith, she knew her vomits, if nothing else. But she's also remembered for 2 other reasons. For one, her cookbook is the first time that there was a recipe for English in print in England. So she really helped make, ketchup a thing. But also, she included a recipe for breeding. So her cookbook at times was considered scandalous. And her recipe to promote breeding was sometimes censored from various editions because it was just too much. So I will mention that her recipe for breeding, it is kind of weird, and you can only understand it if you look at the various herbs in herbals from the time. So she mentioned something called a stinking auroch. And this is a herb, a weed that for whatever reason was associated with issues pertaining to the mother being code for the uterus. So we're looking at a recipe that was meant to help a woman become pregnant. But what's interesting about this is that you're supposed to take it for a full week. And as long as it lasts, you're to accompany not with your husband during the taking. And accompany is a euphemism for sleeping with. So you are to kind of stay away from your husband for a week, but at the same time, you're to be very cheerful and to let nothing disquiet you. So this recipe, it gave women some agency in trying to become pregnant, but it also too was considered to be rather scandalous. Most cookbooks that had these therapeutics, they normally would not include recipes for breeding. And these cookbooks also wouldn't normally include recipes that discussed slavery in the Americas. And this is another reason why Eliza Smith's cookbook is so important, especially the later cookbooks, she discusses the life of an enslaved man in South Carolina whose name is Caesar. And this man did exist. You can find references to him in South Carolina government records. He was an enslaved man who came up with a cure for a snake bite. And there's this huge trial where all of these other, prominent white men came in and they vouched for this cure. His cure was considered to be so significant and so life-altering that he was granted his freedom along with an annuity of £100 a year for the rest of his life. So these cookbooks, again, as we mentioned time and time again, they're more than compilations of recipes. They reveal hidden histories as well. And Eliza Smith's cookbook was kind of not looked at for quite a bit of time. And when people began to look at the various editions, and they noticed that this particular edition contained this 3 pages documenting this life of the slave, it was a huge deal. And many people began to look into the life of Caesar. And there's this interest in looking at the other ways that enslaved populations contributed to both cures for ills as well as to cooking culture. So this, in a sense, is a groundbreaking cookbook. But Eliza Smith isn't the only prominent woman who had quite a legacy in 18th century England. One of my favorites is the exact opposite of Eliza Smith, and this is Hannah Glasse, who wrote The Art of Cookery. And Hannah Glasse lived the life of an 18th century adventuress, right? She was a teenage bride. She, was a lady who stayed time and time again at debtor's prison. Pardon me. And she was also the seamstress to the stars, as well as being one of the most influential cookbook writers of the era. This lady is a hoot. And oftentimes I think about these historic figures and whether or not they would survive in the 21st century. And let it be known that Hannah Glasse, she would be like a real housewife if allowed today. She is quite the character. So this is the title page to the 1774 edition of her Art of Cookery. And I want to point out that her name isn't on the title page, rather it's by a lady. And this isn't unusual. Many times women who would write these books, they were not necessarily encouraged to have their name attached to the text. In Hannah Glasse's case, because her cookbook, especially the introduction, was so well written, there were all these rumors that she didn't write it, that there's no way that a woman could write a cookbook that was so well organized and such a hoot, so much fun to read. And members of certain kind of intellectual members of 18th century society, they really and truly created this campaign that said, she didn't write this, it was written by a man, and I know who wrote it. And for years, people did not believe Hannah Glasse wrote this book. And I just want to show you that, just kind of talk a little bit about Hannah Glasse herself, that she is kind of considered to be a Martha Stewart figure, like a lifestyle guru. And she made a lot of food trends happen, including the 18th century hedgehog. The dessert hedgehog is this really kind of charming almond-based confection. And it was something that was part of the aristocratic diet. You would see this, at feasts and stuff for people who had tons of money, royalty basically. But she really helped to popularize it. And this is a very bad photo. These cookbooks can be very hard to take, but down here you have her recipe to make a hedgehog. And right next to it is a hedgehog recipe from one of our manuscript books that dates to around the time when Hannah Glasse's cookbooks were being printed. So it shows these influences of these printed cookbooks and how they could really kind of create food trends and really change the ways that people eat. And it also briefly changed the way that I ate. I decided to take on the challenge of recreating one of these recipes. So if you would like to make an almond hedgehog, you can do so as well. Here's my little confection. And we will be sharing with all participants, with all the attendees of the talk today, a really cute PDF booklet that contains a variety of 18th century hedgehog recipes, along with a 21st century recipe. So all the mod cons that you would need to make this today. So, we have to celebrate Thanksgiving a little bit differently this year, but maybe you can create a new tradition, the Thanksgiving hedgehog. Anyway, back to Hannah Glasse. I just want to talk a little bit about her personality. And it really is, it expresses itself so clearly and just in such a fun manner. In her prologue, she wrote this tremendously funny introduction to her cookbook. And to the reader, she mentions, she really hates French cookery. And a lot of 18th century women cookbook writers despised French recipes because French recipes were the recipes of the court. They were also the recipes that were associated with male chefs. And male chefs who had a lot of power would often denigrate the type of cooking that women would do. So we'd often see these weird asides about the evils of French cookery. And to Hannah Glasse would say, so much of the blind folly of this age that they would rather be imposed on by a French booby than give encouragement to good English cook. I just love this, a French booby, right? I just picture Hannah Glasse like subtweeting up a storm day in, day out. Again, she would be a Twitter diva. And her hatred of all things French continues when she has a recipe on French sauces. So she has right here, the French way of dressing partridges. And then she gives you this recipe because this is the type of recipe that she is expected to include in her cookbook. But then at the very end, she goes, this dish I do not recommend, for I think it is an odd jumble of trash. She is calling a recipe trash. Like, this is beyond the pale. You do not see this in other printed cookbooks of the period. Hannah Glasse was a personality with a capital P. And I'm telling you, Real Housewives, Twitter, reality TV, this woman would fit in perfectly with 21st century culture. And she also seems to have a real beef, if you will, with Eliza Smith, the complete housewife. She mentions that she is not going to take it upon her to meddle in the physical way, further than 2 recipes. Basically saying that, you know, she's not a physician. If you're sick, you go to a doctor, you don't go to a cookbook. And then she also too talks about how I'm not going to talk to any lady about economy or marketing. And again, this is something that Eliza Smith's cookbooks talk about again and again and again. So this is a very pointed and really seems to be directed toward Eliza Smith. And there's a bit of a sordid reason why. The thing about Hannah Glasse is that she has quite a personality and her cookbook is enjoyable to read, but she really plagiarized from other people, especially Eliza Smith. And that's really apparent here in these 2 recipes for a lemon cream. And if you look just at the first line, take the juice of 4 lemons, a pint of water. Basically, Hannah Glasse took Eliza Smith's recipe for her own. Oh yeah, she went there and she didn't care. In fact, a lot of Hannah Glasse's recipes are plagiarized, or if she would change them, she would make them more decadent. Instead of a pound of butter, she'd say, make it 2. So she was really into luxury and opulence and making, you know, food trends, making things beautiful and grand. Again, like totally a foodie for Instagram, right? But the direct opposite of Hannah Glasse is Mrs. Raffold, who was a self-taught chef. She was a cook. She had her own bake shop. And, you know, she would include other people's recipes with full credit. And other people, because they respected her, would say that their recipes were by her as well. And I want to move along a little bit, but I just want to point out this illustration here. This is from the frontispiece of the 1786 edition of the English Housekeeper. And it shows Mrs. Raffold holding a cookbook. So she's giving it to the reader. So she's passing along her knowledge to the next generation of cooks, the next generation of ladies' maids. And I just really love this depiction of her, because it just says so much about how Mrs. Raffold was viewed in English society, how respected she was, and how her cookbook and how she presented herself, the recipes she contained, how she wrote these things. She really seemed to be a friend, someone you could trust, someone you could rely upon. And you see this in how she expresses her recipes. And I'm just briefly want to show you her recipes for cakes, because she really helped to popularize the wedding cake, or what she would call the bride cake. And she would start off these chapters by giving you observations on cakes. So she assumed that you might perhaps be a novice chef. So she would talk to you about the things that you would need to know before starting to bake anything at all. And she would like walk you through it, and she tried to write these very clear and very concise recipes. And I think this is one of the reasons why she was so cherished. She was like very humble, and she strove to be organized, orderly, and succinct. And we're now going to move across culture and time to America in the 19th century. And I'm making this juxtaposition because Mrs. Raffold, in her desire to write things simply and clearly and in a well-organized manner, I see parallels to that with a woman named Mrs. Fisher. And we're looking at a cookbook, and this can be very hard to read. It's what Mrs. Fisher knows about old Southern cooking. And this cookbook, believe it or not, is one of the most important American cookbooks and was completely forgotten until the 1980s. And just why is this cookbook so important? It's because it is the first cookbook that we're aware of that was written by a person who was formerly enslaved. So this was written by Mrs. Abby Fisher, who somehow or the other made her way to California. She started her very own pickling and jam shop in San Francisco. She became a noted, award-winning chef, and she eventually wrote her own cookbook. She had her own copyright. But when I say she wrote her own cookbook, she couldn't read and she couldn't write. She was illiterate, but her recipes were all transcribed. So people actually sat down with her and wrote out her recipes. I mean, this is just an incredible, incredible endeavor. And she really was forgotten for well over 100 years. So the story goes that in the early 1980s, there was an auction of cookbooks, and someone went through and they found a copy of What Mrs. Fisher Knows. And this person realized that, wait a second, this cookbook, it sounds like it might have been written by a woman who was a slave. And all this research was done, and people began to recreate her life. And they also tried to track down other copies of this cookbook. It's believed that about 100 of these books were printed, and only a few are known to survive. Our copy, we just acquired it back in August, and we're so proud to have it. But as you can tell, it's in really bad shape. But again, it was because it was constantly used. We see signs throughout of water stains, burn marks, you name it. But the fact that this book exists and that it shows the expertise and skill and the life of a woman who found success out of slavery, it's humbling and incredible. The very first recipe that she includes is a recipe for the Maryland beef biscuit. So it's very interesting to see right off the bat our state being represented. And she also includes other recipes too for how to make puddings and how to make hash and how to make an infant diet. And my apologies, can't really see this, but one of the ways we can tell that this book is transcribed has to do with something called circuit hash. This is succotash. It's believed that she had a very strong Southern accent, and the Californians who were transcribing it may have had a hard time understanding every word she said. So circuit hash became succotash. We also, people also too believe that she came from probably Alabama or another state in the South, because she does have recipes that are indicative of plantation culture. Here we have a recipe for pap for an infant diet, and she identifies it as a plantation staple. And I went into newspapers.com the other day, and we found additional information about Mrs. Fisher, and about information about her cookbook and about where her store was located. So again, it's so cool to see the history of this woman coming alive. I realize I am running a bit out of time, so I'm going to move ahead a little bit here to mention other things that these cookbooks reveal about kind of social justice and culture of the times. As was mentioned earlier, we're going to be doing in December a cookbook webinar, and we're going to be concentrating on holiday baking with the suffragettes. So we're going to be talking a little bit about the history of suffrage cookbooks and holiday recipes that the suffragettes promoted. So that should be a lot of fun, and that's going to happen on December 29th. But a lot of people are surprised that suffrage organizations would create cookbooks. But of course they would, because these were portable forms of advocacy. Women were expected to know how to cook, and cookbooks were a benign book. They weren't scandalous at all. And by kind of creating these cookbooks that were often community-based, you could basically say, look, I can vote, I can be knowledgeable about politics, and I can still cook. I won't be derelict in my duties at all. But these recipes often have a dash of subject. You have wacky recipes, such as being anti-suffrage favorite hash. So they'd have these recipes that would totally make fun of people who didn't like suffrage. You would also have weird, bizarre recipes, like pies for suffragettes' doubting husband. So you'd have all of these like weird, really goofy, humorous recipes juxtaposed with the real deal. You would also begin to see the advent of vegetarian cookbooks too, and especially with socialite vegetarians. So one of my favorite being Maud Russell-Lorraine, who was such an ardent vegetarian that she didn't even wear leather. And this cookbook, the Golden Rule Cookbook, was a huge splash in the 19-teens. And she was known for her Thanksgiving dinner, which was all vegetarian, and which I will mention, I'm going to try to recreate next week for a Thanksgiving Instagram challenge. So you have that to look forward to. And finally, Jell-O. And we're jumping ahead here because I want to make sure that we have time for questions. So this, of course, is America's most favorite dessert. And it also is, in many respects, the salvation of American womanhood, because the Jell-O girl introduces the Jell-O bride to how to be a good wife through Jell-O. Jell-O cures all. And Jell-O is part of a proud tradition of women chefs in America. And you see here all of these wonderful women who made a name for themselves through their cookery. And all of them are aligned with big Jell-O. And what we find out through Jell-O is that the Jell-O bride is not like the other girls. The Jell-O bride is the cool girl, right? She's prepared for all emergencies. Anytime her husband wants to bring men to the house, she's got Jell-O on hand. So what have we learned is that we must obey the Jell-O girl. And indeed, we should think back upon all these other tremendous women chefs of the past and think about their life lessons, their delicious recipes, and all of their legacies, and see what we can do in the kitchen to revive them. And thank you for your time. I know I've been talking quite a bit, and my apologies for that. It's already 12:42, but I'd love to hear about any questions you may have or comments or whatever. And thanks so much for your time.
Well, thank you. This was really interesting. And I don't know about everyone else, but I'm hungry and oddly hungry for Jell-O. So I think I'm going to have to make Jell-O for Thanksgiving. We do have some great questions. And for all of you listening, if you have more of them, please put them in the Zoom Q&A at the bottom of your screen. And I'll just start with this first one. Where was Jane Spencer's book printed?
Okay, so it was never... it's a manuscript book, so it was handwritten. We know that, all we know is that it was handwritten somewhere in England. Now, the good thing is with a lot of genealogy databases and things like Ancestry.com, we might be able to do some research to figure out precisely where in England, but this would be a huge undertaking, but it's something that I would love to do. But that's a really great question, and just shows how these cookbooks can offer us so much research potential.
That's wonderful. They really are sort of a collection of the time period and a glimpse into the past, which is exciting and interesting. Another wonderful question we have is handwriting analysis one of the prerequisites for studying these? Because some of them are hard to read.
Right. And I mean, I have no formal training in handwriting analysis at all. But the good news is that there's so many manuals from like the 18th century, for instance, that would teach you how to write. So when I was learning how to read some of these, I actually consulted, manuals of the times to kind of figure out some of the standards. And what I will say though, is that it's kind of like handwriting today. Some people have incredibly legible handwriting, whereas other people like me, when we try to write something, it's an absolute disaster. So handwriting standards differed greatly in the past as they do today. And some manuscripts, you can read them easily with no training at all, whereas others do require a certain amount of skill and expertise.
That makes sense. Are these cookbooks digitized and available online?
Right. So what I'm really excited about is that we are in the process of digitizing all of our manuscript cookbooks and making them available in our institutional repository. So our hope is to make all of these available for people to download as their very own PDFs, which would be really, really cool.
That's exciting. So were these books one-offs, the manuscripts, or were they written in multiple copies? Or were they more of just like a food journal that somebody kept or the author kept and they were passed along to somebody else?
Yeah, well, that's a really kind of cool and interesting question. So with these manuscript cookbooks, what we believe is that these are unique, that people are just like writing down their favorite recipes. But we do have recipes that are ascribed to other people. So there was this whole entire network of communication, and perhaps it was by correspondence. So there's some evidence that people would share recipes with each other, that they may have gone to each other's house for dinner and be like, oh my gosh, this was really great. Could you tell me how to make it? And they would receive the recipe by post. So you also had people kind of gathering together and sharing things in person too. So recipes were transmitted through various communities and to various people. And that's why it would be so interesting to recreate some of these networks. Like with the manuscript book we looked at, it would be so cool to see if we could find any existing manuscript cookbooks by the recipe writers that are referenced in that book, and seeing if perhaps there's some recipes by Alice Stormer or Mary Wise contained in these other recipe books that are scattered throughout the world. And that's one of the reasons why digitizing these books and making them available is so important, because we can then recreate these forgotten communities.
Were most of the cookbooks from the United States, or did they come from Europe?
Right. So the cookbooks in our collection, they started out mostly being from England, but we also now have a great deal of cookbooks that were printed in America. And one of the things to keep in mind with kind of cookbooks in America is that the first cookbooks that were printed, say, in what became the United States in the 18th century, they were reprints of 18th century English cookbooks. So they weren't adapted to American agriculture or to the American palate. So these really were just pirated copies of English editions. It wasn't really until the early 19th century that you really begin to see a lot of cookbooks being created that are suitable to what was available in America.
When people back then cooked, how did they measure? It seems like baking requires and cooking requires precision measurements at times. And how did they do it?
Well, and that's a big thing. Like, there's no standardized utensils at all. It was so wacky. People would use whatever was on hand and whatever they could afford. And I really think that so much of it was just based on observation and personal taste. And you really have to give a lot of credit to American women cooks of the 19th century, for especially like the Boston Cooking School, for really helping to create cooking standards, standard utensils, standard measurements. Much like what we have like America's Test Kitchen today, the Boston Cooking School was doing something similar, trying to create really good, tried and true recipes with precise measurements and precise ingredients and precise utensils and tools.
That's really interesting. This is a good question, jumping back to the digitization of the cookbooks. Will there be indexes when you digitize these books?
Okay, right. Well, actually, this is a big project. So as you know, we are dealing with a pandemic right now, and our Hopkins undergrads, our wonderful special collections student employees, are doing remote work. And one of the projects they're doing right now is transcribing the cookbooks. So once we make them available online, we'll also be able to have a PDF of transcriptions, which will be searchable. And I think it's going to be really, really cool. So be able to look at the real thing and then, an English, a transcription that we can all read. So that's a future plan. And it's really, really cool.
That's a lot of work. Please let those students know we all thank them.
Oh, and they love it. They're having so much fun with it. Like they got to select the projects. It wasn't like, you have to do this. They had several different projects and they all went to transcribe cookbooks.
That's amazing. Well, we appreciate it. So this is a good question. What made Jell-O so popular?
I have no idea. Well, I mean, gelatin-based cooking, it was a thing starting in the 19th century. It was inexpensive and versatile. And you didn't really need a whole lot of, skill to make it useful. So, and also too, just advertising. I mean, really, we all want to be the Jell-O girl. And I just mentioned this because whenever I show that Jell-O booklet to students, like the Jell-O girl becomes their idol. They're obsessed with her. And they really and truly were like, we must obey the Jell-O girl today. And I feel like, okay, in order to get you guys to listen to me, I must channel the spirit of the Jell-O girl. She's a big deal. And really Jell-O, they need to, reconsider, rebranding her for the 21st century.
Not a bad idea. What is your favorite recipe that you've come across?
Oh my gosh. I'm going to be kind of completely basic and just saying the hedgehog. And that's just because it's just so cute and just so weird and also slightly disturbing. But I also just really, it's just kind of really interesting too, because, people today, there's this whole entire thing about, oh, look, almonds, like them being like a big deal, very expensive, and like the environmental crisis surrounding the, the propagation of almonds and everything. But just realizing that almonds were always a big thing, that this isn't a new food trend, that people in the Middle Ages were drinking almond milk. I mean, people love the almonds and they love hedgehogs, and why not combine the two? And I just kind of love this idea of people creating these whimsical and fanciful things for the dinner table, because I think this is something, these things that look very surreal, and it just seems so Instagrammable. It seems to be so indicative of how we live and eat today, and the food trends and making things fabulous. I just love it. Plus it's vegetarian, so it's one of the rare things I find in these super old cookbooks that I can actually eat.
I'm excited to make a hedgehog for my in-laws.
They're gonna love it. It's really cute. It's kind of disgusting, but I mean, it's more for show, and maybe it's not disgusting. You will love it. It's just very intense, super intense. It's like eating almond marzipan. It's really intense.
Sounds exciting. I'm excited to try it. So this is another good question. How available was refrigeration?
Yeah, so you see that it becomes much more available in the 19th century. So you see this even like in America, for instance, you actually have like refrigerated train cars so that you could actually deliver like ice across the country. So this is something that you really see becoming much more available in the 19th century going into the 20th.
Well, that is fascinating. I know friends of mine have a little building on their property that they used to use as the cooling area. They used to store food in it. So it's really interesting. They've turned it into something else now, but the history is great. We love history. So it looks like we are all done with our questions. We really thank you for your time and your talent. And we also want to thank all of the attendees for joining us today for the webinar. A follow-up email is going to be shared with all of you with a recording of today's program. Heidi is going to share with me the booklet so that I can share it with all of you in my follow-up email. So we hope that you're going to join us at another webinar. The upcoming suffragette cooking webinar is going to be great. And we have a number of other lunch with the libraries in this series. So we hope you'll join us too. And I encourage you to please stay safe, stay healthy, and have a lovely holiday season if we don't see you. Take care.